Listen to part of a lecture in a city planning class.
In the last 50 years or so, many American cities have had difficulty in maintaining a successful retail environment. Business owners in the city centers, or the downtown areas, have experienced some financial losses because of a steady movement of people out of the cities and into the suburbs. In general, downtown areas just don't have that many residential areas. Not that many people live there. So, what have city planners decided to do about it? Well, one way they've come up with some ways to attract more people to shop downtown was by creating pedestrian malls. Now, what is a pedestrian mall? It's a pretty simple concept, really. It's essentially an outdoor shopping area designed just for people on foot. And, unlike many other shopping malls that are built in the suburbs nowadays, these pedestrian malls are typically located in the downtown area of the city. And they have features like wide sidewalks, comfortable outdoor seating, and maybe even fountains and, art. There are variations on this model, of course, but the common denominator is always the idea of creating a shopping space that will get people to shop in the city without needing their cars. So I'm sure you can see how having an area that's off limits to automobile traffic would be ideal for a heavily populated city, where the streets would otherwise be bustling with noisy, unpleasant traffic congestion. Now, the concept, which originated in Europe, was adopted by American city planners in the late 1950s, and since then, a number of United States cities have created pedestrian malls, and many of them have been highly successful. So, what have city planners learned about making these malls succeed? Well, there are two critical factors to consider when creating a pedestrian mall: location and design, both of which are equally important. Now let's start with the location. In choosing a specific location for a pedestrian mall, there are, in fact, two considerations: proximity to potential customers, that's what we would call a customer base, and accessibility to public transportation, which we'll get to in just a moment. Now, for a customer base, the most obvious example would be a large office building, since the employees could theoretically go shopping after work or during their lunch hour, right? Another really good example is a convention center, which typically has a hotel and large meeting spaces to draw visitors to the city for major business conferences and events. But ideally, the pedestrian mall would be used by local residents, not just people working in the city or visiting the area. So that's where access to public transportation comes in. Either the designers plan to locate the mall near a central transportation hub, like a bus terminal, a major train or subway station, or they work with city officials to create sufficient parking areas not too far from the mall. Which makes sense, because if people can't drive into the mall area, well, then they need to have easy access to it. Okay, so that's location. But what about design? Well, design doesn't necessarily include things like sculptures or decorative walkways or even eye-catching window displays, art. Although I'd be the first to admit those things are aesthetically appealing. However, visually pleasing sights, well, they're not a part of the pedestrian mall design that matter the most. The key consideration is a compact and convenient layout, one which allows pedestrians to walk from one end of the mall to the other in just a few minutes, so they can get to the major stores, restaurants, and other central places without having to take more than one or two turns. Now this takes careful and creative planning. But now what if one ingredient to this planning recipe is missing? There could quite possibly be long-lasting effects. And I think a good example is the Pedestrian Mall in Louisville, Kentucky, for instance. Now, when the Louisville Mall was built, it had lots of visual appeal. It was attractively designed, right in a small part of downtown, and it pretty much possessed all of the other design elements for success. But now here's where my point about location comes into play. There wasn't a convention center around to help draw in visitors, and, the only nearby hotel eventually closed down for that same reason. Well, you can imagine how this must have affected local and pedestrian mall business owners. Sort of what we call a chain reaction. It wasn't until a convention center and a parking garage were built about a decade later that the mall started to be successful.
What is the main topic of the lecture? Listen to part of a lecture in an architecture class.
Today, we're taking a little detour from the grand styles of public architecture we've been studying to look at residential architecture in the United States. Since this is something we can all identify with, I think it'll help us see the relationship between the function of a structure and its style or form. This has been an ongoing theme in our discussions, and we'll be getting back to it in just a moment. But before we get started, I want you to take a moment to think. Does anyone know what the single most popular style for a house in the United States is today? Bob?
I bet it's the ranch-style house.
Well, in this area, probably. But are we typical? Yeah, Sue.
How about the kind of house my grandparents live in? They call it a Cape Cod.
That's the one. Here's a drawing of what we consider of a classic Cape Cod house. These days, you see this style all over the United States, but it first showed up in the U.S. Northeast, in the New England region, around the late 1600s. For those of you who don't know the Northeast coastal region, Cape Cod is a peninsula, a narrow strip of land that juts out into the Atlantic. And so many houses in this particular style were built on Cape Cod that the name of the place became the name of the style. Now, why did the Cape Cod style house become so popular in the Northeast? Well, one reason is that it's a great example of form following function. We've talked about this design principle a lot, about form following function. And what did we say it meant? Someone give me an application of this principle. What does this concept that form should follow function, how would it be applied to housing design?
Well, if it means that the design of a building should be based on the needs of the people who use it, then, the architect has to be very practical to think about the people who will actually be living in the house or working in the office building, whatever. So for the architect, it's all about the users, not about showing off how creative you can be.
Good. Of course, for a Cape Cod house, it might be even more accurate to say that form also follows climate. Who knows what the climate's like on Cape Cod?
Cold in the winter.
And whenever I visit my grandparents, it's really wet. It's usually either raining or snowing or foggy, and windy too. I guess because it's so exposed to the ocean?
That's right. So take another look at this drawing, and you can imagine how this design might be particularly helpful in that kind of climate. Notice how the house sits fairly low to the ground. This relatively low, compact structure helps the house withstand the strong winds blowing off the ocean. And look at the slope of the roof. The steep angle helps keep off all that rain and snow that accumulates in the winter. Another thing, Cape Cod houses usually face south to take advantage of the sun's warmth through the windows. And that's helpful in winter. Now, what can you tell me about the chimney? About its location?
Well, it's in the middle because does that have something to do with heating the houses? I mean, since the heat never has to travel very far.
That'd mean you can heat the house more efficiently, right?
Exactly. Now, see how the house has very little exterior decoration. And that's also typical of early Cape Cod houses. The wind was one reason. Nothing sticking out that might blow away in the harsh weather. But there was probably another reason, not related to the climate. More a reflection of rural New England society back then. You see, Cape Cod houses were not built in the big cities where all the rich people lived back then. These were modest dwellings. The people who built them simply couldn't afford lots of expensive decorative details. But it was more than just a matter of money. In these rural areas, people depended on each other for survival. Neighbors had to help and support each other in a difficult environment. So you didn't want to appear to be showing off. You'd want to avoid anything that might set you apart from your neighbors, the same people you might need to help you someday. So all this helped to create an attitude of conformity in the community. And you can see why a modest, a very plain style would have become so widely imitated throughout rural New England.
It is plain, but, it's nice looking.
Good point. And, in fact, it's precisely that aesthetic appeal, the purity, the nearly perfect proportions of the house, that's another reason for the Cape Cod's enduring popularity, even in places where the climate's so mild that its functional design doesn't matter.
What aspect of architecture in the United States is the lecture mainly about?